I want to welcome everyone to the annual lecture of the Asper Center for Zionist Education here at Shalem College. It's wonderful to see such a tremendous crowd, but that's a tribute to our speaker. The Asper Center for Zionist Education here at Shalem and tonight's event exists because of the vision and generosity of the Asper Foundation. Their sustained commitment to serious Zionist education is what makes evenings like this possible. And at this moment in our history, this work is more important than ever. We are deeply grateful for the support of the Asper Foundation. It's now my privilege to introduce our speaker. Dr. Tal Becker is the Senior Vice President of the Shalom Hartman Institute, where he leads its education initiatives on Israel and the Jewish world. He has a doctorate from Columbia University, is a recipient of the Rabin Peace Prize, and won the 2007 Guggenheim Prize for Best International Law Book for his work, Terrorism and the State. But his credentials are really only part of the story. He is quite simply one of the most influential and consequential voices on Israel on the international stage today. For more than 2 decades, he has been on the front lines of Israel's diplomatic, legal, and policy challenges. He served as legal advisor to Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He has been a senior member of Israel's peace negotiation team across multiple rounds of talks over time. He has represented Israel before the International Court of Justice, and he was a key architect, which we are very grateful for, along with all that other work, but especially he was a key architect of the Abraham Accords, personally negotiating and drafting the agreements with the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco. There are few people in the world better positioned to help us understand the significance of this moment for Israel's future. His topic tonight, Between Victory and Vilification, Israel's Paradoxical Moment. Please join me in welcoming Tal Becker. I apologize for that.
Okay. Thank you, Russ, and thank you to the Shalem Center and the Asper Foundation. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm not sure the Shalem Center would ever do this, but if we were able to resurrect Yahya Sinwar and invite him here and ask him, what does he think about the last 2.5 years? Who'd won this war? I think he might say something like this, maybe embellishing a little bit to make himself look better. He might say something like, well, you Israelis won in the Middle East, but I won in the West. And you know what? My main battlefield was not the Middle East. I was using the Middle East to get the ammunition I needed in order to fight in the main battlefield that I saw a weakness in, and that was in the West. And frankly, on that battlefield, I didn't even see you some of the time. This is another way of saying that in wars, I think you're trying fundamentally to do 2 things. You're trying to take away the capabilities of your enemies to harm you, but you're also trying to take away the appeal of the story that they're trying to tell, the reach of the story that they're trying to tell. And I think one of the ways to think about these last 2.5 difficult years is that we have had extraordinary success, even if not complete and even at high cost, in taking away the capabilities of our enemies to cause us physical harm. But we have not had success in taking away the assault on our story. In fact, if anything, I can't remember a time where our story has been more under assault. And almost I feel like from a national security perspective, someone who has lived in this space for a long time, it sometimes feels to me that we are more challenged today in the West than we are in the Middle East. In the Middle East, it feels to me like Israel has the tools, first of all, to push back against the physical threat we face. And even at the level of stories, we have, I think, especially in the Abraham Accords and the process of normalization, at least a competing narrative to the narrative that we are confronting from Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, and so on. In the West, it feels a little bit different to me. And I want to focus a little bit on our challenge the paradox of our success and capabilities, but our challenge to our story. It feels, I won't be the first to say this, but, hatred of Jews has gone through several phases. And it's sometimes described as the anti-Judaism phase, which is the assault on the Jewish faith. The anti-Semitism phase, which is the assault on the Jewish ethnicity or race. And we are now fully in, though it's always been there in the last decades, the anti-Zionism phase, which is the assault on the Jewish story, the collective Jewish story, which is seen in a lot of the discourse that I'm sure all of you see as uniquely evil somehow and uniquely demonic. So I want to spend a little bit of time on this issue of the legitimacy crisis, and maybe start by just focusing on what legitimacy itself is. What do we mean when we say legitimacy? I've thought about this a lot. You may disagree with me, but I think legitimacy, best understood when we talk about it in terms of the assault on Israel's story, is relates to the cost of association. In other words, what is the cost that someone pays for identifying, associated, or being in relationship with Israel, with the Jewish state, and to some extent with the Jewish people, given the resurgence of anti-Semitism in so many parts of the world? And what we mean by the challenge to Israel's legitimacy is that in a lot of circles, the cost of having that association has gone up. If you are an average politician, an average journalist, an average student on campus, an average hedge fund manager, whatever it might be, and you may harbor some sympathies or lack of a specific position on the issue of Israel, you look around at your environment and you see, wow, I need to be careful here. The cost of that association has gone up tremendously. The chilling effect, the silence. And yet I want to ask the question, why has it been so hard to tell our story? Why has it been so hard to have that story heard? You might think that the Jewish people are amongst the best storytellers in the world. Part of, and I don't just mean Steven Spielberg, part of our very survival has been a tremendous capacity of storytelling. And yet something's gone wrong in our ability to tell a story in a way that can be heard. Maybe we were always just talking to ourselves in our stories anyway. Recently I came across a report, a governmental report from 1969 of a committee established by the Prime Minister at the time on why Israel's public relations are not succeeding. This is 1969. And you read that report and you just go, oh my God. Why is it that it's been so difficult? So I want to start by talking about why some things that, there are many factors, and I don't want to suggest that I'm going to cover all of them tonight, but I want to start by suggesting some of the factors that relate to us, to Israel itself, and then we'll talk about the others. We'll talk about the speakers, then we'll talk about the listeners. So first, I think that there are three systemic factors with respect to Israel and with respect to this war that makes it quite difficult to make us good storytellers as a people right at this moment. The first is that at some level, Zionism, Israel, is a country established by people who were abandoned by the world. And as much as Zionism is optimistic about the Jewish people, it's not that optimistic about others in relation to the Jewish people. A people who emerged because they were literally abandoned by the rest of the world is not naturally going to have an ethos that their strategic messaging really matters. And if you tell I think an average Israeli, whatever you do, you've got to frame it, make sure your talking points are right. Yes, they get it maybe at some cerebral level, but it's not in the instincts of a people who David Ben-Gurion famously said, it doesn't matter what the non-Jews say, slightly laundering that term, it matters what the Jews do. This is not a justification, I should be clear, it's more in the realm of trying to explain the phenomenon. I think the second component, the second kind of systemic problem in our capacity to effectively tell our story is that we spend quite a lot of time in public relations to our enemies as opposed to our friends, because we have to. We would like the Middle East, certainly the bad elements of the Middle East, to fear us, and we want the West to love us, and we don't know how to do both things at the same time. What do I want a general in the IRGC to think about us? Essentially that we are a Rottweiler, perhaps a Rottweiler with rabies. What do I want Emmanuel Macron to think of me? That we're a French poodle. And I don't know how, we don't know how, if someone here does, you should tell us, please, how to be both a Rottweiler to the people we have to affect their mindset because they're threatening us physically, but also to be a French poodle. We don't know how to do both. And I think most of us, certainly those who live in national security worlds like myself, when we're asked to prioritize, we tend to prioritize the way we affect the calculations of our enemies over whether our friends like us, because they're the ones who have the immediate threat to the lives of our children. That's a second factor. A third factor, I think, and this is a little harder to talk about, but I'll talk about it, is that the kinds of things, especially in this war, the Israeli public wanted and needed to hear, are not the things that would have resonated well in the West. Fundamentally, the Israeli public wanted to hear, how are you getting the hostages out? How are you killing the people who intend to annihilate us? And how are you protecting my son and daughter on the front line? Those are the things that mattered to an Israeli public traumatized by October 7th, feeling the annihilationist threat around it. And frankly, I think what the West wanted to hear from us was hope and empathy. Tell us a story about how this leads to a hopeful future, and demonstrate how much empathy you have for civilian suffering. Those are hard things to do in a war like this. I personally think empathy is critical. Even if you're not responsible for the suffering, you need to be able to express empathy for it. But in war, it is very hard to express empathy, especially in this kind of war, especially in the nature of this conflict. And hope, frankly, I don't know if you share this feeling, but I think it was pretty widespread. There wasn't an immediate language after the devastation of October 7th and the Iranian ring of fire and the threat that we face to immediately enter a language of how we see a direct line between this and peace. We could maybe have told a story, and in my mind we probably should have told a story, which I think is the true story of this war, that the purpose of this war was to take away the capacity of the enemies of peace to dictate the future of the Middle East. There was never going to be a path to any kind of coexistence in the Middle East without confronting those forces. So yes, you could have told that language, but I think it would have rung hollow with hostages being tortured in tunnels to the Israeli public. And my experience with Israeli politicians, I've spent quite a bit of my life with Israeli politicians, is that what the Israeli public want to hear kind of matters a little bit more than what a congressman might want to hear. Now, none of this is to say that we couldn't have done a better job. A little bit more competence wouldn't hurt us. I've never met a Jew who thinks we have good PR. I've met plenty of non-Jews who think we do, by the way, but never met a Jew. And I think we do need to ask ourselves serious questions about how we get back into the language of aspirations, for example, of how we avoid both language and policies that risk empowering our enemies and alienating our friends. There are ways to help ourselves more than we have. But these systemic problems, I think, have followed us through the confrontation we had in the last 2.5 years, and in some way Israel's story as a whole. So I've talked a little bit about the Israeli side of the equation. I want to talk about why it's so hard for this story to be heard. For me, at least, I think a core function of the way Israel is heard is actually very little to do with what Israel says or does, but much more to do with the glasses the person watching us is wearing. Yuval Noah Harari, in his book Homo Sapiens, has this really interesting idea that human beings took over the world because of their capacity to cooperate in massive numbers in the absence of intimate familiarity. Hundreds of thousands or millions of people could work towards the same goal, would sacrifice for it, even be willing to sacrifice their lives, and that capacity to cooperate was tremendous. And Harari says what made that possible was the greatest innovation of human beings. I think the greatest innovation of human beings is the air conditioner. But Harari says the greatest innovation of human beings is the capacity to tell a story. And if you tell a story that is compelling enough, you create a relationship. You create a sense of community where people feel that they are on a common journey. They are willing to work together with each other. And I think one of the key questions we need to ask, or one of the key questions that has affected Israel's story, has not so much been our story, but what has happened to the story of the West about itself, and the glasses that the West wears. Let me put this in American terms. So if your story of America is that America is a promised land for persecuted people to become self-empowered, you're already a Zionist without us even speaking. The connection you feel in the common story to Israel's story is almost natural. Those will be the glasses you wear when you look at Israel. If your story of America is that it's a white Christian country that has been exploited by immigrants and by foreign states, you're going to have a harder time. And if your story of America is that America has never overcome the legacy of slavery, that is itself a colonial power, that it needs to apologize for its power, that it cannot redeem itself, if that's the kind of language you have about America, a kind of self-hating language that you hear on the progressive left in America, there is no version of Israel that you can have a relationship with in terms of a story. And so at some level, what's happening here is a battle not over the way Israel tells its story, but the way the West talks about itself. And I just came back from Australia, and if I could say more broadly, if you look at the West writ large, I think what we're seeing across the West is the kind of hijacking of nationalism by ultranationalists and the hijacking of liberalism by kind of radical progressives. And liberal nationalism, if you're a liberal nationalist, that's a kind of sweet spot for Jews, and it's a sweet spot to understand the Jewish story. If you're a nationalist, you understand the value and importance of collective identity, and you're going to identify with the Jewish people as an amazing story of a people who held on to their collective identity and returned to their ancient homeland. If you're an ultranationalist, the way I think of ultranationalists, ultranationalists are people who love their country but hate most of the people in it. And also, the only nationalism they value is their own. And in that sense, they don't have space for that general idea of collective identity that needs to be championed more broadly. And if you're a liberal, the chances are you believe in the celebration of difference. You believe that the Jewish people deserve to be recognized and even celebrated for their difference. But if you're kind of a radical progressive, it kind of gets flipped, and all of a sudden, you don't believe in difference at all. Unless you have absolute conformity with a set of dogma, then everybody else is rejected. And so, in some ways, the battle over the way Israel is seen is ultimately a battle over not Israel's effective communication, not Israel's policy in one direction or another, but each country's battle over the story of itself, and we see that battle taking place across the Western world. I want to take this one level deeper about this, because I think it's not just about stories. It's also the state of the societies themselves. I've been thinking a lot about conspiracy theories lately. They're interesting things, conspiracy theories. One of the cute things about them is the non-falsifiable nature of a conspiracy theory, right? Either there is evidence of a grand cover-up, or there is no evidence of a grand cover-up, which just proves how effective the cover-up is. You can't break it. What is the function of the conspiracy theory? I think the function of the conspiracy theory is to explain to people who feel powerless, or people who feel like the world is not going the way they want, why they are not to blame for that situation. There are nefarious forces at work. There are forces that are producing this outcome. Don't worry, you don't need to look in the mirror. You are not the result of your failure, the cause of your failure, I'm sorry. That failure has been caused by other forces. And societies that feel like, where the citizens in those societies feel powerless, where they feel overwhelmed, where they feel like they can't succeed, the attraction of the conspiracy theory, I think, is very great. In America, one of the polls I've seen recently is that 70% of Americans no longer believe in the American dream. In other words, they no longer think that America is the land where you can make it if you try. I call this the kind of Europeanization of America, in the sense that you're trapped wherever you are in the class that you find yourself and you can't move. It's not a land of agency and opportunity. And if you think that, you are desperate for someone to tell you, potentially, that it's not about you. And three things happen, I think, when you're drawn to conspiracy theories. The first is, you love to be told that there are nefarious forces that are to blame. The second is, you see the success of others as something to resent, not something to emulate. You look at the success of any group and you say to yourself, what privilege did they have? Not how did they achieve it? How can I do the same? And the third is that Jews become annoying. This generation of Jews become really annoying. Why is that? Because if any people could blame nefarious forces for the absence of their success, it might just be the Jewish people. And yet, this generation of Jews, in Israel, but also in countries around the West, have probably had the greatest success of a minority in human history. And it's almost like we're in ideological, we're a train coming in the direction of that ideology. How can you make the case that nefarious forces are preventing you from succeeding when exhibit A of the human capacity to overcome is right next to you? I was thinking what the opposite of conspiracy is. What is the opposite of the word conspiracy? I think the opposite of the word conspiracy is Zionism. Because what is Zionism? Zionism is the refusal to be a victim. It is the refusal to say that because there are forces opposing me, what can I do? Not my fault. Zionism is the complete ownership of agency. And you can see how, if you are trapped in a feeling that you have no agency, how in the infrastructure of the consciousness of the way you think about this, the Jewish story runs up against you. I think Israel stands for two very unpopular ideas today. The first is that victimhood is not a virtue. It's a condition. And it's a condition you need to try to overcome. It's not a badge of honor. It's not the oxygen of identity. And the second, even less popular, a shocking thought, that power is not a vice. Power is a responsibility. And Jews having power, at least a little bit of power, might be one of the most just outcomes in human history. Now you have to use that power well and wisely. Should not be intoxicated by it. It's a means, it's not an end. Might does not make right, all of that is true. But might does not make wrong either. It's very nice to be moral and powerless. It's just not very important. The way you do good in the world is by having power. So you can see how this kind of, it's not just the stories, but also the injection of this conspiracy language puts us on a collision course. I'm doing something quite strange this year, and that is that I'm learning the New Testament, the Quran, and the Torah at the same time in parallel. The Torah I've done quite a bit of. Quran and New Testament is quite new for me. And one of the things, I'm going to say something quite simplistic, but I did ask my chevrutot of my Quran Islamic scholar and Christian scholar who was teaching me whether this might be an accurate thing to say. Each of these religions has a different imagination about the relationship between the individual human being and the divine. Islam, as its name suggests, imagines a relationship of submission. Master-servant, essentially. Christianity, I think, fundamentally speaks about the human being as the undeserving beneficiary of God's love. The human being themselves probably not capable or not worthy, but God's grace compensates for it. And in Judaism, I think, though we have elements, and of course it's more complicated than I'm saying, at least the Judaism I was raised on imagines the human being as the junior partner in the relationship. There's a senior partner, yes, but we are partners in the effort of creation. We are builders. We have responsibility. We are agents. So all of these things that have infected the way I think so many parts of the West are telling the story about what's happening to them makes the story of Israel quite difficult to hear. A second thing, a year or so ago now, a student from Connecticut came up to me and she said, "I'm a rich white Jewish girl. I have the cloud of oppressor class hovering over my head. Nothing you say to me is interesting. I'm not interested in Tal Becker's explanations about what's going on in the Middle East and why Israel did this and why Israel did that, because none of that helps me get the cloud off my head. The only thing that helps me get the cloud off my head is if I dilute my Jewish identity and I'm anti-Israel." And I think it's really worth understanding that comment, because I'm a recovering lawyer trying to get rid of it, but it's hard. But Jews in general, we tend to think that if only we could pin someone down for long enough and make effective arguments for long enough, they will be persuaded. Just look at my PowerPoint presentation for a little bit longer. And I think this deeply misunderstands the way people form and change opinions. Most people, I think Shalom College students might be a little different in this category, but most people do not form and change their opinions just because someone made a persuasive, rational argument. Especially not if the cost of adopting that argument is social exclusion. If you're going to pay a social price for it, you have a real problem. In other words, unless it's cool, the argument is not going to work very well in many audiences. I kind of think that Taylor Swift wearing a hostage pin is worth about 10,000 Israeli spokespeople, effective ones. And what that means is when we think about the way we tell our story, it's not just about good talking points and good arguments. It is about creating cultural legitimacy around that. And I don't have enough time to go into that challenge. I myself am not cool, so I'm certainly no expert on the topic. But one of the things that's critical is the idea that Cass Sunstein talks about in his book, How Change Happens, of norm entrepreneurs. Cass Sunstein has this idea about how movements take place. How did the Me Too movement happen? How does the whoosh factor take place that moves what are called norm cascades from something being unacceptable to acceptable? And he describes this phenomenon of the norm entrepreneur, which is someone who has charisma and courage to express an idea that is widely held, but thought impermissible to say. And that courage of a person to express that unleashes people with a little bit less courage who have that same feeling, who are then able to express it. And then the next and the next and the next until you create that whoosh factor. It doesn't always work in a positive direction. That, I think, is what happened with anti-Semitism, basically speaking. October 7th, I think, marks the end of the post-Holocaust era, which is essentially the end of the time where it was socially unacceptable to say anti-Semitic things. I don't want to use the word courage, but you had figures who broke that taboo and then unleashed it more and unleashed it more until you have that kind of whoosh effect. And the only way to confront that is not just by having effective arguments. You need norm entrepreneurs and moral courage to push in the other direction. And we need desperately those voices, not Jewish voices, not people identified as pro-Israel, but people who have standing in their own societies, who can show leadership, who express a view that pushes back against that shift. Third, so I've talked about the West's issue, a little bit about the coolness, what I could call the coolness factor. The third is what I call the oracle problem. So you know how peacocks do that thing with their feathers, right? So evolutionary scientists ask, why is this attractive to a peahen? Because doing that thing with your feathers, kind of strutting with confidence in the wild, seems like not such a smart move for the peacock, right? And why wouldn't the peahen be more attracted to a peacock that had good camouflage and ran quickly? So the theory that evolutionary scientists give, which I'm not sure is right for peacocks, but I think it's right for human beings, which is why I'm saying it, is that the peahen says to herself, wow, that peacock is strutting with such confidence, they must have a capability that I lack. It doesn't make sense for them to be strutting with such confidence in the wild unless they had some power or some strength, some authority, something that makes it make sense. I better propagate the species with that peacock. So let's forget about peacocks. Let's talk about human beings. I think we're living at a time where basically none of us know what the hell is going on. There is just too much information flowing in every direction. There is, you know, if you're anything like me, you can read an article and it will persuade you, and then you can read an article that says the opposite thing, and if it's well written, it's pretty persuasive too. And at that time, what happens to us as human beings is that we are drawn to peacocks. We are drawn to those high priests, those oracles that we say, you tell me what's going on. For some people, those peacocks are called podcasters, I believe. Yes? But all of us, in this mess of not knowing, in this overwhelming sense of uncertainty, in this abundance of contradictory information, we look for the high priest or the oracle. And a lot of these high priests and oracles do not deserve that title. Israel is particularly challenged by one such peacock or oracle, and that's called the United Nations. the way the United Nations is treated in a lot of the Western world, especially Western Europe, and in parts of the rest of the West, is as an authority in what is legitimate and illegitimate. When you're watching a TV interview, let's say, I don't know, MSNBC, and Rachel Maddow says something like, this UN report confirms that Israel has committed war crimes, the subtext of that is this peacock, this body with authority, credibility, authenticity, independence, has determined that you are no longer part of our moral community. You are no longer invited to our parties, and everybody watching here should see the signal that I'm sending out. Do not invite them to your parties. But the problem is with the oracle. You know, there's this famous saying that if you want to eat a sausage, don't find out how it's made. And unfortunately, certainly in Israel's experience, and I have way too many stories to tell about this, unfortunately, it is quite unlikely that the non-democratic, anti-democratic countries that often dictate the agenda at the UN are animated by what is an independent and impartial assessment of what the moral and legal situation should be. But the problem we have is that the West, and I say this from a little bit of experience, maybe a bit too much experience, most of my colleagues in the West, over my years as a diplomat, they know how the sausage is made, but they eat the sausage anyway. The mafia can sometimes write the criminal code, and then you give it this halo of credibility by just ignoring the fact that the mafia was part of the drafting committee. So we have a challenge in the oracle space as well. 3 challenges, I think, that we don't talk about enough. The challenge of the West story of itself, the challenge of being cool. I have this fantasy right now that anti-Zionism is so cool that it's about to be untrendy. If only we could create the countercultural move. It's a bit tiring at the moment. And then the third is to how do you cultivate oracles that are worthy of that name. I just want to end maybe by saying that I think particularly after the Holocaust, we adopted as Jews 2 core mechanisms for survival and thriving. If I had to simplify it, I would say Israeli Jews said, this is a brutal world, we better get our hands on some power. We better be a little bit skeptical about people who are offering us goodwill, because it hasn't turned out always that well. We better build a resilient society. And then I think a lot of Jews in the Western world said, we better champion societies that elevate the restraint on power, that are committed to pluralism, to diversity, to minority rights. Those are the kind of societies in which Jews will thrive. My mother is here. I'm very happy she's here. I have the kind of Jewish mother, no offense here, who says, Tal, put on a jacket, I'm cold. Right? Put on a jacket, I'm cold. Right? Which is very lovely of every Jewish mother. I'm sure everybody here has the same kind of Jewish mother. But it is to say that, you know, in the conversation between Jews in Israel and outside of Israel, it's quite often the conversation is put on a jacket, I'm cold. In other words, what we in Israel saying to Jews, gee, don't you understand that you need some power to deal with these forces? And they saying to us, don't you understand you need to be a little bit more pluralistic, a little bit more this, a little bit more that? And each of us are speaking from our own positions and our own problems. But these challenges, I think, have been challenges, or strategies, I should say, of essentially a strategy of preservation versus a strategy of acceptance. Can we try to embrace societies in the West where we will be accepted as Jews? And in Israel, can we make sure that we are strong enough that nobody can mess with us? I'm not going to develop this. Maybe you'll invite me another time to develop this, but I want to say that in my view, following October 7th, it might be time for American Jews to care a little bit less about what people say about them. But it may be time for Israeli Jews to care a little bit more. And we need to kind of calibrate our attraction to preservation and our attraction to acceptance. Because at the end of the day, Israel's legitimacy is a core part of our national security. We can't achieve safety or normalcy or exceptionalism without it. I think it's a core part of the Zionist mission as well, for Jews to be able to exhale. For Jews, we have been so resilient as a society, but it's okay to be tired of being resilient as well. And also, that legitimacy is critical for the unique talents of our people, the amazing things we have to contribute to be possible. I started with a story about the UN. I'll end with a story about the UN. I was at one of these gatherings. An ambassador from an African country comes up to me and he says, "Tal, I have to tell you something. I will never press the button to vote against Israel in any of the resolutions against Israel. The Jewish people are such a special people. They could not have survived in the way that they survived without Hashem's protection." He even knew the phrase, Netzach Yisrael lo yishaker. And I'm not pressing a button against God's people. This is literally what this ambassador said. To which I said, "Mr. Ambassador, that's very nice, but your country votes against Israel every single time." And he said, yes, I send my deputy to press the button. I don't press the button. Thank you very much.
That was a wonderful talk. I just want to say, before we get to something more serious, that you're a lot cooler than you think. Just the Australian accent alone, I think, takes him to a higher level. I'm just going to ask a single question, then if we'll have time for two questions. If someone would like to ask a question, raise your hand. I'll take one here and one there. If you come down here, you can ask after mine. My question is this. There's a lot to be pessimistic about. You gave us plenty of reasons for that. The challenges of our listeners and the West, and most of the people in this room are of an age, thank God there's some young people here, but most of the people in this room are of an age where we're living in times we could not have imagined. And so there's much to be pessimistic about. But you strike me as an optimistic person, and I know you're a person of hope, not just for Israel, but for the region and our relations with our neighbors. So say something hopeful. Give us something to go home with that's a little more cheerful.
So, I think the first thing to say, if you look at the sweep of Jewish history of 3,500 years, most Jews through most history would trade their place with ours. There has probably never been a generation of Jews with this much power, this much influence, this much voice, this much capacity to shape their future as this generation. And I'm kind of allergic to the language where people say, you may have heard this phrase, the holiday from history is over, right? As if we're going back to some previous moment in Jewish history. There were no F-35s in the Spanish Inquisition. And I just think that we risk falling into the trap of forgetting what a blessing we have of the agency that we have as a people. So that's one thing I think it's worth understanding. None of this is inevitable. There are definitely, as I feel, in the Middle East, tremendous opportunities. And in the West, it's a much more complicated picture. There is a backlash to the phenomenon that I described in significant parts of the West. I believe in something I call the permanent possibility of the presently unimaginable, by which I mean we are constantly surprised by things. So that's one thing. And the second thing I have to say is that I get tremendous confidence from the next generation of young Israelis. of which my children are some. I feel my kids basically saying to me, Dad, get out of the way. Give us the torch. We're taking it from here. Thank you very much for your efforts. Not so much for your results. Give us the torch. You feel an energy from a younger generation of Israelis that is extraordinary, and a talent that is extraordinary. I love this phrase, nechadim meyastim, the founding generation of the grandchildren. And you do feel that energy amongst the younger generation of Israelis to write the next chapter. And so I'll say one last thing about optimism in the way that I think about it. There is, no offense to any Americans in the room, but there is an American version of optimism, and I think a Jewish version of optimism, and they're quite different. The American version of optimism that I've experienced is a little saccharine, right? The glass is half full. If only we can get people to talk to each other. One of my favorites is all we need is political will, which is basically saying all we need is everything, right? These are kind of misleading ways to be optimistic. And then I think there's a Jewish version of optimism. And the Jewish version of optimism is, we're not optimistic because the glass is half full. We're optimistic because we have opportunities to put water in the glass. We live at a time of Jewish history where we get to put water in our own glass. That wasn't always the case. And so I think embracing that sense of agency is a source of great strength.